Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from. Welcome to episode 96, Jason, of Industry Insights. We are continuing our long-running series on ransomware. You may remember that at Veeam we issued just a couple of weeks ago, maybe we're getting closer to a month now, Jason. A special research project around ransomware. Was independent. It wasn't just Veeam customers. It was industry-wide, right, Jason? Of 1,000 organizations that actually got compromised by ransomware. We've been detailing some of the lessons learned. But Jason, we want to invite everyone to give a shout out where you might be tuning in from. Please put that in the comment section. We've pre-populated where Jason is in Texas. I am in Colorado. We've got production taking place in Georgia as well as overseas in Romania. And I see that we've already got Ohio that's tuned in as well. And thank you to our Veeam team. Thank you for those that have already chimed in. Be sure to put any questions, comments, or just give us a shout out where you might be tuning in from. So, Jason, we feel like the last several episodes, we've basically gone a bit glass half empty, if you will, meaning we've described some of the dangers, some of the issues associated with it. We're just going to do a quick touch on that, and then we're going to turn it around and talk about some of the positives, some ways or strategies, techniques that you can actually think about how to put yourself in a better position to remediate against ransomware.
Yeah, so let's kind of wrap up the doom and gloom with these last data points. So this actually comes from two different research projects that were published in 2022. The first one is certainly from our flagship, the Data Protection Trends Report. Nearly 3,400 unbiased responses. Again, not Veeam customers. This is a blind panel run by a research firm named Vance and Bourne. In that project, 3,400 folks were asked, what percentage of your data could you get back after a ransomware attack? And on average, it's about 64%, if we can kind of go that first slide. So that's from the Data Protection Trends Report. We followed up on Data Protection Trends and said, let's go really understand and quantify the ransomware problems. We went off to another 1,000 organizations, in this case, all of whom, as you mentioned, have had a ransomware attack. And we find out something similar. They said 69% of their data is recovered. That doesn't include, by the way, the 11% that couldn't even try, right? So in fact, if you take 64 and 69, blend it together, let's just say the problem is roughly around 66 and a half, 66 and 2/3. So our last doom and gloom before we pivot off is the average organization, when they get hit, will lose 1/3 of their data. Is probably the easiest way to say that. 1/3 of what gets encrypted does not come back. And so let's spend some time talking about what the 1,000 organizations looked at from a technologies perspective and how they're addressing for that. And to start with, when you're recovering or when you're remediating from ransomware, certainly the goal that everyone has is to get clean data back on the servers, right? And so we asked the very simple question, how did your organization ensure that the data that you were reintroducing into the environment actually was clean? And you see a range of answers here. Dave, I actually want to focus on one, and then I'm going to throw it out. And what I mean by that is in this upper right-hand corner, you see that 31% of organizations said that the way that they're introducing clean data is by making sure the data was immutable. And as our friend Chris Hoff, who I think stood in for me for a couple of weeks while I was out, is very quick to mention, is that immutability doesn't actually mean clean, right? Immutability means that whatever you put in that container is still what's in that container, right? You can have an Nalgene bottle, but is that Nalgene bottle water or bourbon? I'm not going to complain about bourbon, but maybe it's poison, right? You don't know what's in that container. So let's take that 31% that said immutability, and we're going to pull that out of the equation and now look at what's left. Still 550 responses, and how do they ensure the data is clean? Dave, I'm loving that slide on the wedge on that right-hand side. 46%, they're using what Veeam calls a staged restore, but the idea of a sandbox to check that data before it gets reintroduced. Love that.
Yeah, I think almost half the people, if we take out immutability, quote unquote, got it right. Meaning, to your point, before they went back into production, they, in a fenced off, safe way, could do further inspection, interrogate, trust but verify, right? And,
Yep. Yep.
that's the name of the game here, is make sure we're not reintroducing something via the restoration process. Now, conversely, though, I'm a little worried if we look over on the left-hand side. Look at the 11% that said we restored it and then we monitored it. So they
Because
already
monitoring
brought it.
worked so well last time, right? So
Exactly, exactly. So detection has already proven to have been a failure point. And so then they restored whatever they had without verifying that first. And then they were going to monitor that for a period of time. But that just means they could have reintroduced day zero threats all over again. So that 11% is not a great answer. Then you look at that 36%, we restored it back to production, and then immediately we scanned it for safety. That's far, far better, of course, than 11%, but it's already been reintroduced back
right.
into the production environment. So left-hand side is not really the way to proceed. There's varying degrees of better, I'll say,
Yep.
but
Yep.
the best answer there is that right-hand side.
I'm going to go ahead and say there's only one good answer on that slide, right? Anything else is less than good. And when you're talking about ransomware, you should not be doing less than good. All right, so that's kind of the problem statement number one is, are you going to be reintroducing clean data? Now, I was kind of dismissive on, the immutability angle because immutability does not equal cleanliness.
Right.
That said, without immutability, the vast majority of organizations actually don't have data to restore. Right. So let's go ahead and double click into that for a second. So this is a banner that everyone should just write down on a Post-it note. And in fact, for the kids at home, take a screenshot of it right now. Just take a screenshot of that and share it with one of your colleagues in house, because this should really make people concerned. I don't know, Dave, if you had a chance to cover this with Chris while we were gone, but one of the big questions, certainly one of the questions in the earlier research covered how the bad actors target the production environments, but certainly along the way, a lot of them are targeting the backup repository, because that's what's going to ensure you have no choice but to actually pay. I'm going to mute out part of this for a second. Dave, 68% of organizations said those bad actors did actually impact some, if not all, of their repositories. This should keep every backup admin and every CISO up at night.
Yeah, totally agree. And we've got kind of a repeating theme here around that 68%, meaning we saw, if we average two different research survey works, that they could only bring back data successfully about 68% of the time, meaning nearly a third of the data was lost. This explains the answer to why might that be the case. At 68%, there was some to complete impact on the backup repository. If you make that, you look at the other way, 31% were unscathed. If we add up the 6 and the 26, only 6, basically 1 out of 20, a little better than that. Let's call it 1 out of 18. The bad actors did not go after the backups as far as they know. But better than 1 out of 4, the bad actors tried but were unsuccessful impacting backups. So what we see here is ransomware is happening a lot. When it happens, they are more often than not going after the backup applications. And when that happens, unfortunately, for those that aren't using best practices, they're getting compromised, getting hit. Now, I do want to pause, make sure we hit the map really quickly as well, because we've had some people come in. Look at that. Okay, so in the United States, in addition to the country, or I'm sorry, states we mentioned of Ohio, Texas, Colorado, we've also got Pennsylvania and New York, and we've got the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Turkey's come in, and then we've also got Qatar, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and India. So many thanks for all hours of the day for people checking this out. Be sure to continue commenting and giving us a shout out where you might be tuning in from. So, Jason, you've made the point so far that unfortunately, when this hits, it hits hard, meaning about a third or a little bit lower of the data doesn't often get restored successfully. If you're going to restore, you need to have clean restores, meaning make sure you're not reinfecting things. Now we're really looking at, if you think about backups and it's all you back up so you can restore, what's the success associated with that? So what are some answers, some ways out going forward?
So certainly the first step is always going to be around, okay, diversifying the kinds of technologies and repositories that you use so that you have a greater likelihood of survivability, right? So the colloquial phrase for this is don't put all your eggs in one basket. For most folks, you ought to really fixate on that 26%, that green wedge that you're looking at here that says they were unsuccessful in impacting our backups, right? They couldn't affect the repositories. Basically, what you're saying there is that the bad actor tried to remove your only other choice other than paying the ransom, and you beat them at that game. Right. So let's talk about what does that really look like. And so one of the questions we asked right behind that is to look at what technologies are organizations actually using in order to provide that, whether it's offline repositories, whether it's air gapped repositories, whether it's immutable. There's lots of ways to separate the repository from live access where it can actually be maligned by a bad actor. And so in this case, we came up with a couple different cloud options, a couple different disk options. There's a tape option there. I love the fact that for most organizations, a survivable copy shows up in a hyperscale cloud, right? So we've talked, gosh, Dave, most of this year on how hybrid architectures and embracing cloud is certainly part of every modern production strategy. Should not surprise anybody that is also part of every modern protection strategy as well. So I love that that's top of mind. One thing that we did to kind of really look at how this kind of comes together, though, is let's figure out what kinds of blends they are. And the punchline here, again, this is another screenshot worthy slide for folks, is in general, 3 out of 4 organizations have a cloud that is in some way offlineable, air gappable, immutable, right? So maybe it's in the technology within that cloud repository. Maybe it's something where those buckets are removed from hot access or not. I mean, there's different ways to do that. But 3 out of 4 organizations have a cloudy protected tier. 2 out of 3, 67%, have an on-premise disk-based tier, which in some way is offlineable, air gappable, immutable, persistent, right? And then Dave, 22% tape. Tape still matters, right? It is hard to get more air gapped than take that tape out of the drive, stick it on a shelf. Can I get an amen from you, brother?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, what I love about this is, of course, this totals up to more than 100, meaning people are using multiple immutable or air-gapped offline strategies, which is absolutely appropriate.
Yep.
And it really shows that there is no one technology, one delivery model that makes sense for everyone, meaning hybrid is a word that we've been using for years. What we clearly see here is a hybrid approach to immutable and offline protection, utilizing cloud services, utilizing on-prem still, utilizing a variety of technologies. That is absolutely appropriate. Here's a great example, Jason, where I think the survey base of about 400 that we got to said they did it and they did it correctly, in my opinion. Now, that 5% is, a little interesting down below, but what we can say is that overall, people are understanding when it comes to protection and remediation against cyber threats, more mechanisms, more capabilities are better than fewer.
Yeah, I think there's a couple nets you can take out of this. So certainly there's that 5% on the bottom, right? That's an exclusive choice. So 5% of organizations said we have no tier of our repository strategy, which has any kind of immutability, air gapping, offline capability, right? So 95% of organizations have at least one tier that is protectable, that is survivable. That said, as you point out, the number comes into about 180%. So on average, organizations have 1.8 tiers. And I love that, right? What this slide really proves, or should prove to organizations, is that your data can be assured to be survivable throughout its entire data lifecycle.
Yes.
right? The copies that are 30 days old, they ought to be on disk. No reason not to make that disk persistent, right, and survivable. The data that's 2 to 5 years old or for non-regulated data could go to a cloud. No reason that can't be air gappable, immutable, and protectable. For that data that has long-term retention, 10 years, or is governed by regulatory requirements, no reason you couldn't put that on tape along the way. So even as the data moves organically and ages through its life cycle process, it should still be survivable all the way through that ecosystem. So I love the fact that organizations out of the 3 tiers are 1.8 persistent. That means we got 1.2 to go, but I love the direction that's heading.
So, Jason, we looked at from the ransomware research report the different repositories that people are using. And thankfully, many of them are using multiple different methods, meaning double play, triple play immutability. And I'll assert that that is the right answer. That's what people should be doing, not that 5% that said that they're not actually using immutability whatsoever at this point. Now, I want to give a shout out. We did a LinkedIn poll of a couple hundred organizations or individuals. We're going to keep that poll active even after we go off the air of this live stream. But if we look at those results, they mirror pretty closely. Now, we instrumented this a little bit differently where it needed a total up to 100, so you couldn't choose multiple. But what I like, Jason, is that, again, you see multiple different technologies are in use. There's no one way to do it. It's not just about on-prem. It's not just about cloud. Again, it's about choice. So I'll go double down and say, if you're in that 5% that we saw in our ransomware research report that said they're not using immutability, I think you ought to revisit that, because as we see in multiple different now research results, there are many different ways to achieve this. And in fact, you could use them in combination to make yourself even more safe, more secure.
That's exactly right. So you have lots of options. There's no reason for you not to have survivable data. And I guarantee for that one person who's trying to save a few bucks, when you get hit by ransomware, and it is a win, not an if, you'll wonder if those bucks could have been better spent than paying for Bitcoin. So, all right. So far we've talked about two kinds of technologies that are lessons learned from this particular project, right? So we've talked about the importance of sandboxing to make sure that you don't reintroduce bad data back into a now clean environment. We've talked about immutability to make sure you actually have something to restore at all. Along that way. The last part of this equation is leveraging automation and orchestration to not only ensure recoverability, but also to speed that time up. So let's talk about first validation. So we've talked about backup for 30 some odd years, and one of the big fallacies has always been, oh, the backup logs say everything's okay, right? And that's what the 60% say. So the question was, does your organization do automated verification or validation of the backups? Meaning, can you actually restore? And Dave, I got to tell you, I think 60% got it wrong.
Yeah, and unfortunately, relying on logs and reports after the fact to verify success is a risky proposition. And so I always think about my first programming experience was on mainframe backup at IBM. And you could get a return code 0. And for those that aren't familiar with that, that return code just means what was the status when the job finished, when in this case, the backup application was finished doing its work. 0 meant it did what it was instructed to do. Now, It could mean return code 0 because it actually found no data that it needed to protect. So therefore, I did what I was asked to do, or working as coded, working as designed, working as instrumented. That doesn't mean that you're actually safe. So that is concerning. As we see kind of an ongoing trend, verification is increasingly important at multiple levels. But a couple of these are at least better. One of them is the right answer.
Yeah, and by the way, you've got the 60% that said the logs. We talked about the fallacy of that. The 44% is very 1995, right? So did I read the media, and did it pick up what I laid down? Again, not that interesting, right? Really, what you ought to focus on is the 16%, 1 in 6 organizations that said yes, every night after my backups are done, some kind of a sandbox, some kind of a test script runs that actually does what I want to do, which is to restore workload. And does file exist? Can you ping it? Is the application running? Test, can you actually restore? And if you're not doing that rigor of testing, then you're really kind of hoping that it's going to be there when you need it. Now, Dave, this is something that Veeam pioneered years ago, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. This notion of automated verification and not just a simple heartbeat ping, but be able to do application level interrogation. Hope when it comes to recovering from ransomware is concerning because you've already basically bet your data in the survivability of your business. And to some degree, you've lost. Now you're trying to bet again and you're hoping for a more favorable outcome. But there are other options that exist, which includes automation, better level of verification. So orchestration is always a good concept. Our colleague Melissa Palmer likes to say that ransomware is a disaster, and in a disaster, automation recovery really helps, doesn't it?
It does. And this is going to kind of be our last data point. So not only do you want to automate and orchestrate the validation of backups, and by the way, if you haven't played with that from Veeam, it's a feature that we call Sure Backup. And if you just do a Google or your other favorite search engine index on Veeam and Sure Backup, you'll find out exactly how powerful and how easily automatable it is. But when we really talk about orchestration, this is that last slide. And I've spent the last 2 weeks off at a scout camp, and they teach the first aid merit badge. And one of my favorite lessons is how do you shrink the time between snakebite and hospital, right? How do you shrink that time? And we talk about cyber attacks. The way that you shrink that time is orchestration, so that you're dealing with multiple servers, large scale problems, lots of details per workload. Humans are not good at repetitive minutia tasks under pressure. You need to be thinking about orchestration. In this case, this comes from our data protection trends report. And I'll point you to that upper left-hand corner, Dave. 25% of these organizations have a good chance of shrinking that time between snakebite and hospital.
Yeah, the good news, I guess, is at least 1 out of 4, quote unquote, got it right. The other two responses, manually reconfigure, to your point, Jason, at time of high impact, at time of high stress, at time of when the CEO, the CIO, and everyone else is looking over your shoulder, either physically, literally, or virtually asking for, when are we going to be back? When are we going to be back? That is not the best time to be searching for where to have ISO images, who has license keys for something. Wait, the network DNS used to be XYZ. What is it now? And then you look at the 45%. Well, we have pre-configured scripts, but we know that there's configuration drift, environments have changed, especially these last 2 years in the pandemic. A lot of us have shifted how we're actually implementing our services. So those scripts, there's a good chance it could be down level. So
Yeah.
as we begin to wrap up, sorry, I didn't mean to step on you there. What we want to do is just give you a little shout out. This coming Friday, we won't have a show. We won't have a Tech Bites. The following Monday, 1 week from today, is a United States holiday, so we won't have a show. But week from Friday, meaning July 8th, we will continue as company Veeam, our ransomware coverage. Our friends Rick Vanover, Melissa Palmer, they will talk about exfiltration of data from a ransomware perspective and cover an assessment of some ransomware issues and best practices that you can put into place. And speaking of best practices, 2 weeks from today, you'll be out, Jason. We're going to bring in from the field our buddy Brad Lynch, who's one of our more outstanding SEs. And we're actually going to talk a little bit now from Veeam specifics, what kind of capabilities, technologies you can put in play that Jason and I have partially teed up today to make sure you're safer and more recoverable. So be sure to check that out. Thank you for tuning in to episode 96. Stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you 2 weeks from today. Bye for now.